Earlier this month, Netflix released the first movie in a trilogy of horrors focusing on teens living in the spooky, scary town of Shadyside. And then a week later they released the second movie, and then a week later the third movie, which is this bizarre and innovative and really quite interesting releasing strategy. But still not the most interesting thing about the film, because as it turns out, the Fear Street trilogy is really, really good. I know, shocking, right? That an R.L. Stine adaptation, and not even his most famous book series at that, has actually ended up being a proper series of horrors. It's gory, it's spooky, it also has some really interesting ideas at its core. And I thought that because there were free movies, it was worth doing free reviews. So I'm going to walk you through Fear Street's 1994, 1978, and 1666, and there will be some spoilers. So if you haven't seen these films, just take it as a token of my appreciation for how good they are, that I'm doing like a half-hour long video review about them. It should show you that I'm serious about these movies being good and they are well worth your time. So check them out and then check back in here.
Dude, what the hell?
This is exactly why you have no friends.
Look, some gal killed a bunch of people at the mall last night.
Holy shit.
In 1994, teen Dina is depressed after the breakup of her relationship with girlfriend Sam, who not only broke up with her, but moved to another town. Dina lives in Shadyside, a low-rent part of town that seems to be cursed with mass killings that occur every few years. Sam has moved to Sunnyvale, a much richer, nicer town that doesn't seem to have any social problems at all. Tensions between these two rival towns are always high, but they're coming to a boil because yet another massacre took place in Shadyside, where a teen in a skull-face mask stabbed a load of his colleagues in a murder spree. Dina and Sam almost come to blows, but are stopped when something strange happens. And it's something that's otherworldly, supernatural. This is the so-called Curse of Sarah Fear, who is a famous witch who died in Shadyside centuries before. The opening moments of the film make it clear that director Leigh Janiak, who made all three of the films, is really focused on using tropes from horror that's contemporary to the period that the film is set in, to kind of ground it in a kind of period feel, I suppose. So in this case, she's talking about the 90s slashers, you know, Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and stuff like that. And I say it's obvious from the beginning because it actually begins with a pretty well-observed pastiche of Scream. We have Maya Hawke, who is probably the most well-known person in this cast, and she's working late at this mall. She gets a phone call that sounds like it might be coming from inside the building type thing, and then she gets murdered. And that's it for her in the movie. And so much like when Drew Barrymore appears in the first 10 minutes of Scream and then gets murdered on screen in this kind of really subversive way, I guess. It's kind of Wes Craven doing a bit of a meta thing in the way that he does with the rest of the Scream films as well. They do the same thing here, and of course it's like almost a double meta because they're calling back to Scream in the way that Scream then played with people's expectations. But I think that's the right side of parody or pastiche, you know. I'm a little bit anti those things because I think they often require more knowledge from the film watcher than they ought to. And then they end up in a sticky spot where it's like, well, if I know enough about this to get this reference, then I'm bored because I know this topic too well, or I think you've done it badly, or I'm sitting there like, what are you referencing? What are you making fun of here? In this case, I think it actually works really well on its own because that's still a good twist. You know, if you're a teenager who's watching this who's never seen Scream, then you don't know that that's a reference to Scream, but the twist just works fine for you. And the less kind of pastiche, tropey period touches are also really good. The art direction of the film does a great job of grounding it in that early 90s moment. Dina's little brother, who's played by Benjamin Flores, who was in another Netflix original called Rim of the World. Quite an interesting talent, I think a good guy, a good actor. When he's introduced, he's sat on those like boxy cream beige computers on an AOL chat room, and that felt to me like a really specifically 90s moment that was really lovely and well observed. Not everything's like that, you know, it's still a contemporary film, and there's a lot of neon cross lighting that doesn't really feel very 90s, it feels very modern, but it's for a modern audience. I think those kind of things are acceptable. Another way that they set up the time period is a little more annoying, and I think it's the most consistently annoying thing across all three films, and that's this kind of jukebox musical aspect to the movie. Janiak uses a lot of like contemporary music from the 90s to set up what's going on and then the time and place that they're in. But they are constantly cutting from song to song. And a lot of them are obvious choices too. When it comes to 1978, I know someone who was like, I bet they're gonna use Don't Fear the Reaper in this. And then they did. And then it's like, well, when are they gonna use Psycho Killer? You know? Oh, here, okay, great. And that's something that's, like I said, is consistent across all the films. In this one, I found it the most jarring. I think the edits are very, very quick. It reminded me in a negative way of watching like a Cameron Crowe movie. I don't know if you've seen Elizabethtown, but that film literally cuts from like the middle of a song to the start of another song, and it's just a lot. So that's all the kind of cutesy elements of the movie. It's pastiches, all the kind of poppy stuff that makes up that part of the film. But what about this movie as a horror film? I was going into this expecting basically like a YA-focused horror, where it was a little scary, it had scares around the edges, but mostly it was pretty soft. And I was very pleasantly surprised to find that the film is a fair bit more daring than it might originally appear, but also a lot more gory. And there is one particular death that occurs near the end of this film that is truly gross, like a really nasty effect, and I did not see it coming, that level of violence. But perhaps more importantly than the gore, the film is actually a proper horror in the way that it's constructed. And that opening sequence of Maya Hawke is a really good example. You know, Janiak, and God, I hope that I'm pronouncing that right, because that's how I'm going to do it for the rest of the video. She's playing with these very familiar tropes, but she's kind of constructing them in a way that they could be read fresh. And I think that's a thing that runs across all three films. We have Maya Hawke alone as a young woman at night, closing up her shop, and there's this moment where she thinks she's being attacked, and it turns out it's just her mate, who actually does end up being the guy who attacks her later on. And I think that plays off a tension that's like, very familiar, I'm sure, to lots of women, where it's about like, is this guy my friend, or is he actually going to hurt me in this instance? And that lends a real tension to those scenes because they're very dramatic as a result. You know, she's being stabbed by this guy and saying like, why? Like, I don't understand what's happening. So she's running away from this killer, she gets caught by him, she gets killed by him, and then she's pleading for her life with a guy that she knew or knows. And that whole sequence is a really clever bit of filmmaking because it sets up the tone. You know, you have this kind of parodic element that then turns serious. You get a sense of where the horror is being pitched. You have a couple of spooky jump scares and then some gore, so it's quite a poppy horror, it's not too cerebral. And you also get the beginnings of the plot because we start to see that maybe these people aren't really spree killers, there's some kind of possession thing going on. And then to kind of cap it and put a cherry on top, it all happens in the shadow of the tree where Sarah Fear died. All those years ago in 1666, as we eventually find out. And you get to see this tree kind of looming over events, kind of stuck up in the middle of this mole. Somehow it survived, or the mole's been built around it. And Janiak has a clever screenplay that takes full advantage of that. You know, it starts off with that big attention-grabbing sequence, but uses it to quietly set up the plot. And then we've got Dina and her younger brother, who is kind of obsessed with the Shadyside murderers. So he's the kind of exposition guy, the info dumper. And then her and her kind of group of mates, plus Sam, end up embroiled in this new possession. See, I'm a bit of a sucker for the idea of like an original sin in a horror movie. And I think it's something that I see in all my favorite horrors. Like every X-Files episode basically has an original sin. And by that, I don't mean the biblical sense of it. What I mean is that like, I think a good horror movie is about something evil that's happening to people in the present day, and then there is some sort of prior act of violence that sits underneath the events, motivates them, explains them, and that gives it a weight. And that means you can be bittersweet because that thing cannot be resolved. You can make claims about like society and ethics within that context as well. And also it can lead to a happy ending, you know, because that means that there is a way out of the horror, which is something that I struggle with in movies like, say, the more anarchic slashers, films like The Strangers, where I'm struggling to understand what the point is. You know, I don't know the motivations of the people or what happens to them afterwards, and they just kill everyone and that's the end of the movies. So this isn't that, and I enjoyed that a lot. But I like that it was almost a self-aware kind of tropey take on that original sin thing. You know, it's not just enough for there to have been this violent act that took place in the 1600s, but that there are actually bones like hanging out, apparently just loose, like available to touch in the forest. And somehow have turned to ash, like, you know, in that intervening 500 years or whatever, but there you go. One of the things that took me by surprise in the film was the central lesbian romance between Dina and ex-girlfriend Sam. I knew that Dina was a lesbian character, but I was expecting something like that kind of tokenistic stuff that you see, for instance, in like a Disney movie, where they're like, yeah, this character's gay, and they'll say that they're gay maybe even, but they won't do anything gay on screen, and they won't be gay. I was expecting like, oh yeah, I really like girls, but I'm not currently in a relationship with one, it's just stopped, and I'm pining after them, and I might look at women sometimes, but we won't ever like touch or anything on screen. So you can imagine my surprise when the film actually treats that lesbian relationship as a central motivation for almost the entire trilogy. It's not just like a tokenistic thing, it's one of the most weighty things in the movie, and it's incredibly important to understanding the subtext of the other two kind of plot lines as well. And not only that, but there is like a sex scene between these characters. It's pretty tame, don't get me wrong, but that's fine. It shows that they're acknowledging an actual lesbian identity on screen, as opposed to using it as like wallpaper to make themselves seem more progressive than they actually are. It's not a perfect script. I think some of the lines are a little on the nose, and I think that the last act of the movie kind of just wraps up a little too quickly. I don't mean the sequel hook for the next section, I mean the section in the supermarket where two characters who are very important get killed very quickly in quick succession, and that to me felt a little unearned and kind of destroyed some of the character development that had happened, for instance for Benjamin Flores' character, Dina's brother. But still, I was kind of blown away by the film because I think I went in with low expectations and I discovered that it's an effective chiller with these clever, scary, gory ideas. I like that it's accessible for a teenage audience, but it's also pleasingly kind of scary and poppy in equal measure. I think in terms of balancing those two tones, it's probably a little too poppy to be fully frightening, but I think that makes it like a great sleepover movie, for instance. I like that it's, you know, made for an audience that absolutely shouldn't be watching it, but absolutely will. That's the way that I kind of conceived of it as I watched it. Yeah, on that note, I'm just going to read you one line from what I wrote down when I watched the film. It's like if American Horror Story was a consistent, coherent idea. There you go. So at the end of 1994, Sam and Dina have made up. They've kind of lost their friends along the way, but they've got each other at least, and finally the witch's curse is over. Nope, joking, it's not. Sam is definitely possessed. A bit of a wrinkle in the plan. And 78 picks up exactly where that dropped off, with C. Berman, who is played by Gillian Jacobs from Community, alone in her house, drinking heavily and relying on a very large system of alarm clocks to keep track of her life. And this is again like a good opening. It's an effective bit of characterization that kind of portrays her without really saying anything about her. It shows it on screen. It's just basic screenwriting. You love to see it. Please, I'm so bored of watching blockbusters that can't just write basic scenes. Thank you, Leigh Janiak. The kids show up to consult her because she is, as far as they know, the only survivor of one of these kind of Shadyside mass killings. And so she launches into this story, apparently in the third person, so that she doesn't give away her identity until the end, about 1978, the Camp Nightwing massacre.
Looks like blood.
Do you have a better idea?
Maybe.
Who are you?
Nick Good.
Bad things always happen to Shadysiders.
You feel it, don't you?
There's something holding us down. Cursing us. Run!
And so after that brief introduction, we have a new cast and a new setting and a new time period. And I'm really jazzed about that part of this trilogy. I really enjoy stuff that looks at the same place through different periods of time. I like time jumps because I think you can do interesting dramatic things with them in terms of tension, you know, how have these people changed, stuff like that. And like I said, I'm a sucker for original sin, you know, in that horror sense, because it gives an extra layer to the story that the horror's telling. It allows you to do kind of more dramatic things with it instead of just here's a random killer who showed up out of nowhere. It's not that, it's a witch's curse, that kind of thing. And 78 does something really interesting with time, but I'll get there in a sec. Let's talk about the plot of the movie. Ziggy, played by Sadie Sink, is this kind of tearaway, a bit of an outcast at Camp Nightwing. The camp is half and half Shadysiders and Sunnyvalers, so there's a lot of tension, and we keep seeing more of what we saw in 1994 about the rivalry between those towns, and also this kind of socioeconomic message that I think comes out more here than in 1994, which is like, not only has Shadyside got this curse on it that means there's like a mass killing every 30 years, but also it's crushed like economically. There's something wrong with it as a place, which means people can't really leave and nothing good happens there, which almost reminded me of Derry in It, the Stephen King story, where it's this town that's kind of got this deep curse that has this supernatural elements to it, but there's also very grounded things that curse causes problems for people in real ways. So Ziggy and her sister Cindy don't get on because Ziggy feels that Cindy is trying to pretend like she's better than she is. She's trying to dress up nicely, she has this new polo shirt that she's very sensitive about getting damaged, and that happens repeatedly over the course of the film. And she's trying to like save up to get into college, and Ziggy on the other hand is very resigned about being stuck in Shadyside forever. I like it when a horror movie does something like that because it adds weight to these sometimes like slightly too fantastical settings that you can get in a horror thing. You know, should I really be afraid of a witch? I don't think witches exist really, so it's sometimes hard for me to struggle to bother about that. But if I can see something like that, the tensions between town people, these economic disparities between them, these injustices, these historical injustices, then that is a thing I can get behind, and it's something that can motivate and ground those more fantastical elements like the witch's curse and stuff like that. It's rad, it's good filmmaking, Leigh. So Ziggy is actually getting pretty severely bullied, and kudos to Sadie Sink, who plays her. You might recognize her from Stranger Things, which coincidentally is made by the Duffer Brothers, and Leigh Janiak's husband is one of the Duffer Brothers, I can't remember which, so nice little cast connection there, as is Maya Hawke in 1994. So Ziggy's getting badly bullied enough that she's actually almost hanged by this group of teens, which is kind of wild, and you have to think, ooh, maybe that's the witch's curse too. Maybe kids are just awful. Hard to say. Anyway, Nick Good, who is the sheriff in 1994, comes out of the woods. He's like just about 18, and he's the love interest for Ziggy in the film. He comes and basically makes sure she gets out of there okay. And they kind of have this will they get into a relationship or won't they kind of thing throughout the movie. The only person in camp who's nice to Ziggy is the nurse, Nurse Lane, whose daughter was one of the Shadyside killers, and in fact one of the ones who was summoned in 1994. She's the one with the razor blade who does the cute song and has the nice hair. So this is another reason why I like this structure, because it allows the films to set up stuff that then pays off in different ways that is sometimes subverting expectations in the other movies. So we know that Nick is this sheriff who isn't necessarily that helpful in 1994, and then we see him as like this good guy who's also interested in law and order in 1978, and that's a really interesting character dynamic, one that's only possible because we see two different versions of that character over a broad period of time. And something similar, although a little different, is happening with the nurse as well, because we know what her daughter's like. She's this like psychotic killer who's otherworldly and all that stuff, and then we get to see the human impact of that in 78 when we see how downtrodden this woman is, and obviously she's become obsessed with the witch's curse. So that's a good example of using those kind of supernatural things to motivate these quite grounded and sad themes, and vice versa. I think that's a really interesting one there. Nurse Lane unfortunately has gone a little bit nuts, who could blame her, and tries to stab Tommy, who is the boyfriend of Cindy. She doesn't manage it, which is a shame because he quickly gets possessed and turns into the Nightwing killer, who we also saw in 1994, although he had a bag over his head in that one. And then after that, pretty much all hell breaks loose, and a number of children are murdered, which was a grim thing that I wasn't expecting, although I know that the killings take place at a summer camp, so yeah, I don't know what I was expecting really. And as you might suspect from looking at it, once again Janiak is playing with these genre expectations that come from horror movies of that time period. And this film owes a lot to those kind of summer camp slashers. I'm talking about stuff like, obviously, Friday the 13th. There's also elements of Halloween in there, and slightly later stuff like Sleepaway Camp, things like that. The most direct reference is that Tommy ends up wearing this kind of rough sack over his head, which is the original mask that the killer had in Friday the 13th. And I think the script is quite clever with this because it takes these very familiar horror tropes, which we see quite a lot of. I think there's lots of like 70s adjacent kind of slasher jokes made in other horror movies and things like that. But what she does with it is then use that structure to tell a more supernatural story than you might expect with that idea, because we end up following Cindy and Alice, who's one of her childhood mates, into this series of underground caverns which turn out to be underneath Camp Nightwing. And down there they find a witch's lair, they find this weird moss growing, apparently where Sarah Fear lost her hand, which is part of the big myth around her. And that feels like a more modern set of story beats to me. It doesn't feel like something that would have been done in a movie in the 70s. And the added benefit of layering the action like that is that it means that the film feels a bit more contained than 1994. To me, 1994's biggest issue with its script was this kind of feel of like, go to this location, get a plot token to move on, go to another location. And that can make it feel kind of episodic. It's like hard to understand how the story is really unfolding. It feels almost video gamey, I think, sometimes. And none of that's really on display here because they're just in the camp running around between a few buildings, and there's basically two plot lines that take place above and below each other. Easy, simple to keep track of, and allows them to focus on scary stuff as well as expanding the story. And as this is the middle movie, it's an interesting position to sit in a trilogy, and it's important to think about these films as a trilogy, you know? You've got 1984 as essentially the first act, where you have this self-contained horror movie that tells like a supernatural slasher story, and then we go one layer deeper, both literally in the story and also in terms of telling that story, where we start to see some of the lore be uncovered in the Camp Nightwing massacre. And part of that's because the kids have come to see Berman, who's telling them this story. She's trying to communicate to them what she found out about Sarah Fear, but also it's about the investigation that those two other characters, her sister and her mate, undertook in the caverns. Of course, how does she know that that's what happened? I don't know, because no one else is there who survives, so that seems like a bit of a plot problem. And as I said before, she's telling the story apparently in the third person, because at the end, when it turns out that, shock twist, Ziggy is actually C. Berman, not Cindy, it's kind of a surprise to everyone sat there listening to it. And I don't know how that would work if she was telling the story. Surely she'd say, yeah, that was me. I got hung on the tree by those bullies. Still, that's just fun. It's just fun tropey convention. And I think that kind of stuff is a pretty white lie to tell in a filmmaking context. Oh, and by the way, on that twist, I literally didn't feel that as a twist. I don't know if it's because I watch a lot of movies or because I write some of my own stuff, but when I watched that film, you know, Ziggy showed up and I was immediately like, yeah, that's Gillian Jacobs. Of course it's not Cindy, who is a completely different character, who looks slightly different even. Yeah, it did not shock me at all. However, again, I can't help but think that the main audience for these films is not me. It's probably like 17, 18-year-olds. And that might work for them, you know. I'm not an 18-year-old. I haven't actually been an 18-year-old for quite some time. But I think that might work for that audience. And maybe more importantly, I think it's not like a load-bearing twist, by which I mean one of those M. Night Shyamalan or Saw-style twists that like changes the entirety of what you've already seen. It's just like a little sweetener, a little kick on the end of the movie. I don't think it really makes that much difference because we don't really know C. Berman except for that one scene at the start of this movie. And so to find out that she's not the person that we thought she was is like, fine. Nothing much, really. Nurse Lane has made this kind of hand-drawn map of the camp and overlaid it over the original settlement where all the Puritans lived, where Sarah Fear was tried and hanged. And it's a really potent image that kind of sums up what this story does for history in the context of horror, because it's like she's literally taken a version of the past and overlaid it on the present. And we see that when they go down into these caves, which are kind of a mass sigil on which the town is overlaid. So we have this kind of layering of historical images of different versions of a place. And it's something that this film in particular versus the other two manages to do a lot of, I think because it's in the middle. Another example of what I mean is in the opening where Ziggy is being hung on the tree. We identify that tree immediately as viewers as being the tree that was in Shadyside Mall. And so we're able to say, right, okay, so that's where this is taking place, like physically. It's quite clever filmmaking because it makes it feel like a continuous universe, but it's also part of that rich thematic underpinning for this otherwise quite dumb series of slashers. So yeah, some genuinely scary slasher stuff in this one, lots of kids dying, some interesting lore being introduced, and kind of reflecting the lesbian romances in the first film. I think there is quite a strong queer subtext for Cindy and Alice, who are these childhood best friends who grew apart and then come back together. It's not really my place to kind of do that full read, I don't think, but there's a lot there if you read it with that in mind. And of course, there's the other love story in this one, which is Ziggy and Nick, which takes on a completely different significance once we find out who Nick really is in 1666. But we'll cover that when we get there. And my last thought on 1978 is that it's once again a mostly fresh-faced cast. I'm really struck by these movies having very few big names in them, not very recognizable actors outside of like Gillian Jacobs and Maya Hawke, and to some extent Sadie Sink. They're new, and I think that's really nice. It's nice that Fear Street feels like a fresh IP. I know it's based off a book series, but it's not that much like the books as I understand it. And it's nice that it's a relatively new director as well, and it's additionally nice, so much niceness, that there's mostly new actors in it. People like Emily Rudd, who plays Cindy, or the excellently named McCabe Sly, who plays Tommy Slater, the Nightwing Killer. I think they're both very good, and they get to show off quite a lot of stuff over the course of this movie and then the following one. So fingers crossed this film will launch some new careers. And what a fresh feeling it is. You know, it feels new, this series of films, in some ways, that you might not expect, considering that it's largely structured around parodying existing horror tropes. And so in the end of the 1978 section, Cindy and Ziggy take this severed hand of Sarah Fear and they try to put it to rest with her body, which is underneath the hanging tree. Except it isn't. And again, we already know that because in 1994, we saw where the body really was. It's what kicked off the whole series of events after the car crash. Sam's blood got on Sarah Fear's bones. And so they're doomed, and Cindy dies, and it feels really, really heart-wrenching because we've followed her and Ziggy throughout the whole movie. And Ziggy somehow survives, and I have some ideas about that once we talk about 1666, but we then cut back to the present day, and the plan is on. They're going to go and put the hand back with Serafir's body, and that's the end of 1978. Right, time for another water break for me. Stay hydrated, all right?
The devil has come to feast on our misdeeds.
And his darkness grows.
Within each of us.
Sarafir, you know nothing good comes from those woods after sundown.
Once again, 1666 picks up where the previous film left off, which is back in 1994, Dina touching Serafir's bones and suddenly having a vision of being Serafir. She's like adopting the body of Serafir in a flashback of some kind. And in fact, most of the townsfolk of Union, which is this small Puritan settlement where the majority of the story in 1666 takes place, are drawn from the cast of 1994 and 1978. It's a really fun thing. It's called multi-rolling. It doesn't tend to come up much in film, but you see it a lot in theatre. And done well, multi-rolling can be used to play with audience expectations. Because we see Tommy Slater as this kind of good guy in 1978 before he's unfortunately corrupted by the influence of the evil that's in Shadyside. We then see him as Mad Thomas in this completely horrible role in 1666, and it's really shocking because you're thinking, God, he's nothing like his previous portrayal there. But some characters seem to be slightly the same. So Kate, who is this kind of drug-dealing honor roll student in 1994, is the equivalent of like this Puritan pusher in 1666, where she's like saying, hey, let's go get high off berries that the witch has gathered, stuff like that. So this is what the previous two films have been building up to, alluding to the life of Serafir. And of course, because it's a story, we find out it's nothing like we originally thought it would be. And the first half of this movie, which is set in 1666 before they go back to 1994 Part 2, is entirely about the life story of Serafir and what really happened. Because of course, spoilers, but also you absolutely know this, you shouldn't be this far in this video without having watched these films. Nick Good, the sheriff of the modern day setting, is actually the distant descendant of Solomon Good, who's one of these Puritans, who it turns out was the original guy to make a deal with the devil. And that deal kind of shakes out like this. He gets what he wants, he gets power, he gets influence, and probably some other stuff too if he asks for it nicely enough. And in exchange, he writes down the name of one person who's going to be corrupted by this like evil, bubbling, tar, tumor-like thing that lives in the caves with the witch's lair. And that person is going to go and murder a whole load of other people. So now we know that the goods are the real baddies. The goods are evil, as the film very on the nose announces. We know that they've basically been using human sacrifice to make their town nicer. And that's where the broad theme of the film finally becomes clear, which is a kind of reflection on how people often make it, as it were, get their wealth, find their comfort off the blood, literally in this case, sweat and tears of other people. You know, there's no utopia that isn't built on the back of someone who's been oppressed. And this is a really good example of that, because Nick and his family, by extension, have been using this supernatural tool to make them succeed and kind of pretending like it's their work. You know, Nick is the sheriff, his brother is the mayor, and yet none of them actually put in the labor behind that. It was magic. It was something that they were doing. I guess they were breaking the rules for themselves and not caring about it. And it's interesting too then that the outcome of this is that there has to be a version of their town that's terrible to live in. And so they've constructed a reality that's good for them, but it's at the expense of a large group of other people. And of course there's a generational disparity too, because these gaps between the wealthy and the poor, in this case the goods and Shadyside, is getting more and more entrenched as the years go on, not least because this deal with the devil is hereditary. So it's just like inherited wealth in that sense. And I don't think this film is the serious take on generational wealth injustices, but I do think it's a good theme. Like, it's a good exploration of that in a relatively simplistic horror setting, at least. And it's nice to watch something like this that is so poppy and so construed for fun, but does have an idea at the heart of it and does want to make that quite clear. It's similar to how clear it is about its lesbian romance, where it's saying, like, this isn't something just to chuck in for wallpaper. This is an important thing that motivates part of the story and grounds it. And when you do get this final reveal you can really feel the anger of the characters who find out about it. And I am there with them in that moment. It's a real like grounding moment for this very fantastical and quite silly final section in 1994 where they defeat the baddie. Ultimately, the Shadysiders are the victims of violence that's nothing to do with them, and it's been inflicted on them. And my favourite little detail about this that I think is really well observed is right at the end, after all the other stuff's happened, Dina and Sam exit these underground tunnels through Nick Good's house, and it's full of motivational posters. Like, you know, those ones with the pictures of animals, like an eagle taking off over a lake, and it says like, hope, you can do better, believe in yourself. And it's such an interesting character detail to have this guy who is literally inherited the ability to have whatever he wants at the price of someone else's suffering, and yet he still feels the need to kind of motivate himself, to think about that as like something good that he's doing for himself. It strikes me as like a really incisive bit of satirical look at like the rich, I guess. But for all that it's kind of like fulfilling the destiny of this trilogy to kind of tell you about the original story that's underneath everything, I think it's also the installment that's most at danger of becoming unmoored, becoming adrift. And the reason why I think that's the case is that it's not that clear what this one is structured around. You know, you had these 90s slashers as 1994's reference. We had the 70s camp slashers as these like references for 1978. But in 1666, what is Janiak riffing off? Is it like The Witch, Robert Eggers? Is it folk horror, maybe? You know, stuff like The Wicker Man? I don't think she is doing that. And she also doesn't have the option of leaning back on this jukebox stuff that's been used way too much in 1994 and 1978. She can't like put on popular tracks that the Puritans used to listen to, because you can't exactly get that stuff on Spotify. She should be out of her depth here. And actually, I think it's a real testament to how good Janiak is a director, that without any of that kind of similarity of reference to anything else previous in the trilogy, she's able just to completely do her own flavour for it, and it really works out. With one exception, and it's something that unfortunately almost derailed this film for me, which is the accents. The way I see it, you're doing Puritan stuff with Americans, you've got like a few options. The easiest option is to have them be American and speak in like an oldie worldy way, and that's basically it. You could do The Witch, where you know extensively research how Puritans spoke and then portray it in like a kind of verbatim way, most likely working with English actors when you're doing that. Or you could do what they did here, which is everyone has an Irish accent of varying quality. Some people just drop it entirely as soon as possible. And unfortunately, despite some valiant attempts, I once again think McCabe Sly is very good. Mad Thomas's accent is very accurate. Dina's accent is awful. It's really, really bad. And I think the actress is good, you know, Kiana Madeira. She did well in everything else, but her Irish accent is terrible. And that's a shame, but what are you gonna do? Luckily, it doesn't completely derail the film because you're so familiar with the characters by that point and you know what you want to get out of the story that it's not really a problem. And I think you get used to it after the first 10 minutes or so. But boy, is it rough. When they first start doing it, it's like, ooh, not good. Now, it's interesting that this focuses so closely on Sarah Fear because putting her at the middle of this witch hunt kind of inverts the structure of the previous films. In 1994, and to some extent in 78, we are with a bunch of characters who are being wronged by someone who they believe is Sarah Fear, and so they're trying to track her down, stop her, like interpret what's going on, and they don't really know what's going on. In the flip side here, Sarah is the main character, we know everything that's going on for her, but she doesn't know the central mystery itself, and she's hunting for someone else. Of course, as it turns out, because Solomon Good is really the baddie behind everything, it is kind of like the structure of the first two films, but it's an interesting contrast that the film sets up early on. So that's good fun. And of course, we also find out that Sarah is a lesbian as well, or at least has desires for another woman, who is, in this case, Hannah Miller, played by the same actress who plays Sam. So it's a Dina, Sam, Hannah, Sarah romance that's going on in this movie as well. And again, it puts a lesbian relationship at the heart of the weighty part of its storytelling. The last moments of Sarah's life are about doing something to protect Hannah. And I think that's really powerful. It helps that the performers are very good and they have good chemistry with each other. But I think the story itself there is really rich, and it's one, again, that isn't using LGBT representation as kind of tokenistic thing. So back to 1994 for the final sequence of 1666. It's slightly confusing when they do this with the titles. It was working well up until now, but now it's a bit confusing. And the characters go to Shadyside Mall, where the story all started, which is a nice kind of loop tying it all back together, because as we know, Shadyside Mall is the site of where Sarah Fear originally died and is built on top of these underground caverns that contain the witch's lair. And so there we've got this kind of like triple level now of history upon history, like the way in which stories are imprinted on a place, because we find out that the mole has access down into those caverns, as you imagine it would, because we saw that there was some access to the surface in the caverns in 1978. I think the literature term for this is a palimpsest, which is like a piece of parchment that you've written something on, and then you've erased that, and then you write over it again, but you can still read or see markings of the other text underneath it. And so they're texts that are overlapping, they're superimposed over top of each other. Maybe it's a bit of a reach to say that the Fear Street trilogy is a cinematic palimpsest that addresses generational wealth disparity, but someone's got to say it, and I just did. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. And I think that's something that's apparent to the characters as well. There was a lovely moment here that I think is really well judged, and I don't know if it was discovered in the editing room or if it was planned in the script, where Gillian Jacobs, Ziggy, grown up, and Dina both stand and look at the tree that's in the middle of the Shadyside Mall. Ziggy looks at that and sees her sister. You know, she has this flash of her sister. She's thinking about her sister who died in the shadow of that tree. Dina looks at it and sees Sarah Fear hanging there and sees Hannah Miller watching her. And so both of them are looking at this one object, but interpreting different types of trauma and violence that have occurred around it through the lens of this single location. And I think that's very clever, adroit, and dare I say, thematically rich filmmaking. And it is far too clever to have any space in something like this, and yet it does. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about this series of films. I think they are earnest in the story they're trying to tell, while also being silly and broad and poppy and pastiche and all that kind of stuff. And that seems like a good place to stop, because I think there's plenty more to talk about in these films, but I'd love to talk to you about it. I hope that you've seen those Fear Street movies and that they spoke to you in the same way that they did to me, or maybe in your own way. I'd love to hear more about what you thought about them. And if they didn't speak to you, I hope that this video helped illuminate some ways in which they might in future, and maybe you can give them a second go. Have a good one, and bye for now.